Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the Samsung Galaxy S22 Plus and see how this particular phone holds up in the year of 2025. Now, a few things to keep in mind. This phone did come out just a couple of years ago. So back in 2022, that's when this phone debuted. So it is a couple of years old as of this point. So we have to kind of think about that as we're going through and reviewing this particular phone. Now that's on one side. The other side too is if you ever want to go ahead and buy this phone or some other phones that I would recommend buying this year, links will be down in the description below. You can go ahead and buy them from there and you can help support the channel at the exact same time. Now, starting off with the outside of this particular phone. This phone, like I said before, came out in 2022. And on the front side of this phone, you're getting a 6.6-inch dynamic AMOLED display. So this type of display, for the most part, still actually looks pretty good. It still is like a pretty decent type of display. It's 1080p, it's 1750, peaks of brightness, which is pretty decent, which is actually pretty good for this type of phone. And it still is a 120 Hz display as well. So that is some really interesting stuff to keep in mind with a phone like this, because it isn't really like the most expensive phone of all time. It's not the, it's not the best looking phone of all time either, considering now we have like much better looking phones, but this thing doesn't really look that old. And there's some areas of this phone that kind of age it, but the exterior I think still looks very, very good for the most part. You're getting that USB Type-C port on the bottom, kind of like a curved metallic side throughout it on the model that I got, which was cool. And on the back side, you're getting this frosted glass back, triple camera setup, and reverse wireless charging, which is amazing stuff to have. Now, from the predecessor to this phone, the build quality difference was pretty big, considering it had a frosted plastic back on the S21, the standard S21, but the S21 Plus had a frosted glass back, but this one still is a really good phone from that particular side. I think one other thing to keep in mind here too, is that the Galaxy S22 Plus still feels like a very, very good phone. When I hold this phone and when I pick it up, I think Samsung did a really good job from the price tag of this phone, and I do think from that side, it definitely gets a thumbs up for me from that particular side. However, there are a few things to keep in mind with this phone that maybe some of the latest flagship phones have that maybe this one doesn't have. A big thing to keep in mind, the S22 Plus from the exterior, it's not really getting those like super bright panels. It still is a bright panel and it still looks great, but when compared to some of the competition, like an S24 Plus, that phone panel definitely gets a lot brighter than this thing. So if that's something that's important to you, just kind of keep that in mind. You're also missing out on maybe like some other features here and there, some other small stuff, but keep in mind with something like an S24 Plus, even that phone is giving you less bezel with more of a flat-sided phone, where this one is giving you this curved-sided phone. So that could in and of itself be another one of those minor things to keep in mind here too. So I think that in and of itself could be one of the things to keep in mind here as well. Now, on top of that, I think some other things to keep in mind here too could be the price tag. This phone doesn't really cost that much anymore. It costs about $237. So I think that is actually a pretty decent price to pay for a phone like this. I mean, that price tag is substantially cheaper than a Galaxy S24 Plus, cheaper than an S23 Plus. So when you think about it, you're getting this massive, really nice display, flagship build quality. You might think that it still is like a very, very good phone to buy. And like I said, in some cases it might be, but I would hold off on clicking that add to cart button and buying it just yet, because there could be some things in this phone that might strike you off that I talk about later on in this video that you might not be the biggest fan of. However, with that being said, I do think one of the better areas of this phone, even still to this day, is probably the camera quality. This type of phone is still giving you a 50 megapixel wide, 10 megapixel telephoto, and 12 megapixel ultra-wide camera. And that is actually a pretty decent type of camera layout to have inside of this type of phone, right? 10 megapixel sensor on the front. You are getting 4K at 4K resolution at 60 frames per second on the front and the back on this type of phone, which is great. But there's another very big thing. You're also getting 8K capability that you can film in on the back side of this particular phone as well. So that in and of itself is another really awesome feature to have too. So if you're going to go through and pick up one of these types of phones, it is actually a really, really nice thing of basically being able to go through and pick up a phone like this that's going to be giving you that type of capability. And I do think with a phone like this, it still is an excellent camera. Now again, if you compare it against the S23s, S24s, even the iPhone 16 Pro Maxes, I think those phones are definitely going to be giving you better build, better camera quality. But you have to remember those phones are more expensive and they're newer, so they better give you better quality. I think this thing for the age and for the price it is actually a very, very decent camera. Again, not the best camera of all time, but I think Samsung did a decent job with it, and I still think if you are going to go through and pick up a phone, it still is one of those types of phones that I'd recommend people to kind of think about if you're going to think about buying a phone with a good camera, just from a camera perspective. But this is one of those areas that I'm about to hit on, which starts kind of showing the downfall of this phone just a little bit. So this brings us to the software. So the software of this phone, it's not terrible, right? It gave you 4 years of software support when it first came out. But the thing now is that this thing started off at Android 12. We're now at like Android 15. This thing's really only getting like one more version of Android and then that's it. So that is kind of a downside. Like if you wanted to go and get a better phone, this thing is going to be in that situation where it's not going to be giving you that next version of software. It's going to be giving you one more version, but it's not going to be a phone that's going to last for like 2 or 3 more years. So that could be a downside if you are planning on buying this phone. And it is unfortunate because the Samsung Galaxy S23 increased the software a little bit, and then the S24 has increased the software even more. So this one kind of got the short end of the stick. It is unfortunate because, this phone still had some capability for it, but it is one of those situations where I look at and I'm kind of more so like, well, it might make more sense to go and buy some other devices rather than this one, because this one's already kind of done getting your software support. So I think that in and of itself is another very, very big thing to kind of keep in mind there as well. In terms of battery, this is another one of those areas. This chipset on this phone had a really weird issue where the battery life really wasn't that great. A 4500 mAh battery inside of this thing sounds pretty good, but this phone was giving you a pretty lackluster type of experience when it came down to its battery size and battery life. The battery size was good, but the battery life really wasn't that good inside of this device. So that was in and of itself another one of those minor issues that we kind of experienced within this type of phone as well. So that was in and of itself another one of those types of issues that we kind of experienced there too. Not the biggest deal in the world, but that was one of those other things. The performance of this phone too though, Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chipset with 8 gigabytes of RAM. Now, some of you might be looking at that RAM and think it's amazing or crazy, but like I said before, this was another one of those issues. The RAM inside of this phone, it was okay, but the chipset, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1, did cause a lot of issues for a lot of people, and that could have very well been a problem for a lot of people as well. And I know I, for one, that was a situation where a lot of people looked at and they thought to themselves, man, that was not a good phone, that wasn't good, for them. And that was in and of itself another type of issue that some people were experiencing here too. Like the battery size was great, but the performance of these phones and just the way they acted just wasn't that great. So overall, I would say this phone starts off looking like a good phone, but towards the end of it seems like probably not the best phone to go ahead and buy. I think it makes a lot more sense to save a little bit more money and buy a Samsung Galaxy S23 standard model or buy a Galaxy S23 Plus. I think in this case, it makes a lot more sense to buy the next generation rather than buying this one. A lot of people complained about it. A lot of people don't really want this phone anymore. And it probably is one of the more interesting flops Samsung made. I think they made some improvements, but the chipset and the battery life really wasn't that great. Well, the chipset was good for me, but the battery life was horrendous. So it makes a lot more sense to buy a different device. So from that side, that kind of covers it up there. If you have any other thoughts or questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that will mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.